All right. Good morning and greetings. Happy holidays. Welcome back, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt here with Emancipations Podcast. And I have a very special guest today, Branko Milanovic, a world-renowned economist and expert on inequality. Let me start by introducing our guest first. Dr. Milanovic got his Ph.D. in 1987 at the University of Belgrade, where he focused on a dissertation on inequality in Yugoslavia. He went on to lead the economics department at the World Bank Research Department for almost 20 years. And then he has had various appointments at the Carnegie Endowment and teaching appointments at Johns Hopkins, Oxford, and currently you are based in New York. Is that right, Professor Milanovic?
Yes, absolutely. I'm at the Stone Center, at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. So I'm both teaching there and I'm part of the Stone Center, which does work on inequality.
So, Dr. Milanovic, could I start with a sort of personal question about inequality for you? What was it initially that drew you to the topic? And what was the impetus? I mean, I think academics are never neutral, which is a good thing. There's always a kind of moral or even a personal touch of. So, could you say something regarding your motivation for studying inequality?
Well, let me first thank you very much for inviting me to talk about the visions of inequality and particularly Marx. As you know, of course, it is one of the crucial chapters in the book. It's very hard not to have Marx as always a crucial chapter. Now, going back to your question, my interest basically, you mentioned that I did my dissertation in Yugoslavia on income inequality in Yugoslavia in 1987. There were not that many studies of East European inequalities in those days. But my interest came from two very different angles, if you will. One was that I was always interested in social issues, and actually talking about Marx. Actually, first time when I read Marx, I was still in high school, and obviously I read the Communist Manifesto and lighter texts, not exactly the Capital. But then the second thing is actually when I studied economics, I studied statistics, and essentially that was very much data-oriented work. And at one point, the two things kind of came together, and they have stayed for now half a century with me. This was this interest in the social issues and ability to look at them empirically. And that's where I discovered, for example, the Gini coefficient, the Lorenz curve, which actually plots income distribution, from the poorest to the richest, expresses inequality in a number, and then allows you to look at, different portions of distribution and so forth. So it was really the combination of the two. And I cannot say that that was either one or the other. It's just the two of them. And as you know, I've remained very much an empirical economist. And my work on income inequality is essentially empirical. And just to mention something about the book that I'm sure that we will discuss, I make a very strong point, as you know, in the very beginning, that when I discuss all these authors, including Kenne, Ricardo, Smith, Marx, and so forth, I discuss them from the point of view how I understand how they would actually think of inequality. But I do not introduce, nor do I discuss normative judgments. And then, of course, I'm sure we will come to that when we discuss Marx, because there is a sort of a split among people who basically focus on Marx's own normative judgment and those like me who actually focus on explaining how Marx, in our opinion, thought about inequality.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, because I think you make an interesting point at the beginning of your chapter on Marx, that Marx, his biography means a lot to understand his critique of capitalism, and I perhaps would invite you to say something about that. You rely on Heinrich's new biography quite a lot, and one of the things that you show, in fact, is that Marx really had an ambiguous attachment to religion, to nationality. In a way, he was a hybrid class figure. He himself is from a kind of upper bourgeois state class through his parents, but his Jewish and German identity, you say, for example, that Marx very easily could have been born in France. And so the idea of locating Marx as a quote unquote German philosopher is not exactly accurate. So I wanted to ask you sort of, why does that matter for you, this ambiguous hybrid, maybe even cosmopolitan, background of Marx? Could you say something about that?
Yes, actually, I would like to take this last word that you said, actually, the term cosmopolitan. And the reason why I wanted to, as you know, each chapter starts with a sort of a personal review of that individual, because I think it's important to locate also in the, people that I'm writing about in the context of their time, but also their own life. So it's not a biography, it's just a kind of pulling out some important parts, which I think highlight a little bit the individual. So for Marx, exactly this cosmopolitan stuff, because nowadays we are much more interested, not much more, but we are getting much more interested in the past in what I can call the third Marx, which is the Marx after Capital, where he faces for the first time questions of how his theory can be applied outside of Europe. And that's actually where he becomes our contemporary to some extent, because he's dealing with issues of globalization, colonization, slavery, land ownership, which is very different in Russia or India from England. So I then actually wanted to say his background is more complex than we generally think. As I mentioned there in the beginning, Leszek Kolakowski in this famous book, The Main Currents of Marxism, starts with the first sentence, which is an important sentence, says Karl Marx was a German philosopher. And that's how we locate him. And it's actually true largely. However, the background is more complex, as you mentioned. First of all, he was born in a Rhineland, which actually until 1815 was French. And the bourgeoisie that he was part of, or his family was very Francophile and Francophone. And so that's, this ambivalence. Of course, Berlin is much further from Trier, where he was born, than Paris. So he could have actually, were the political situation different, had not Napoleon been defeated, he could have gone to Paris to study. And of course, as you know, we spent quite a lot of time in Paris anyway, and his French was almost like German. And then secondly, a part which actually Michael Heinrich brings out very well is the Jewish heritage and the questions that were posed to his parents, in particular to his father, when he needed to convert to Protestantism in this particular case, in order to retain his lawyer's job as a lawyer, because being a lawyer in Germany, actually rather Prussia in those days, meant being a state employee, and you could not be Jewish and state employee. So that's another aspect. It happened before Marx's birth. We don't know exactly the month when it happened, but we know approximately, the year when it happened. And then also the fact, for example, I didn't know that actually until I read Heinrich's book, that his mother was Dutch. I knew there was some Dutch connection, but I didn't realize it was very strong Dutch connection through his mother. And that connection was also a connection to a very famous Dutch family of the Philips, the people who actually are quite famous of large industrialists that actually many of us remember as refrigerator and all these white goods. And then he spent also quite some time in the Netherlands visiting on different occasions, visiting his family on the mother's side. I saw, for example, recently his house in Maastricht, where he would visit. So, the point was then to put him in this broader European context and to some extent global context. So it's not only Germany, as you can see from this, it's also Jewishness, it's also Christianity after the conversion, Dutch connection, French. So it's, of course, and then he lived in England for a long time and so forth. So there is much more to him than simply saying he's a German philosopher.
Yeah, I mean, he's a European a product of this cosmopolitan confluence. And one of the things about the quote unquote political Marx, right? The Marx of class struggle, the Marx of the 18th of Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and even the Marx of the Paris manuscripts, is that most of Marx's experience with political class struggle is in France. And I think that should never be underestimated, precisely because the legacy of the revolutionary tradition in France is arguably the most dynamic, right? The most robust, the most, it's the site where the most revolutionary fervor has occurred historically since the revolution. And I want to now take a step back to understand Marx in relationship to the neoclassical economist and to Ricardo, who is the sort of natural bridge in understanding capital, wage, in understanding the theory of classes. A lot of Marxists pick up on this similarity between Ricardo and Marx. And even I've heard many Marxists say that if you don't master Marx's 3 volumes of Capital, you will remain what they call a left Ricardian, right? So, and that's a danger, actually. And some people have actually accused Engels of remaining effectively a left Ricardian. Yeah. Could you say some things broadly about what distinguishes Marx from Ricardo? Maybe some of the essential aspects of the difference between these two thinkers, and why Marx should be read almost in continuity, but as a break from Ricardo.
I agree entirely that, of course, the links between Ricardo and Marx are extremely strong. And Schumpeter says if there is one teacher, if there is one economist whom Marx essentially could consider as his teacher, it was Ricardo. And he said it was not so much in sort of simply continuing Ricardo, but seeing the economic problem. The actually quote is correct. I mean, if I remember the quote exactly, is that the economic problems presented themselves to Marx under the Ricardian sort of a structure. So in other words, he saw the economic problems the same way that Ricardo saw them or that he described them. The class struggle in Ricardo is extremely strong, although, it's not something that Ricardo per se put at the center stage ideologically. But the Ricardian model that Marx inherited was the model of the 3 classes, landlords, capitalists, and workers, who are fighting about the distribution of that pie. And of course, that pie increases. And of course, in the case of Ricardo, the condition for the increase in the pie was that capitalists would get larger slice than landlords, and workers were assumed to actually have, for technical purposes of the principles, to actually always keep the same real wage. Now, what was, I think, a big difference between Ricardo and Marx is that this class struggle that was seen in Ricardo as really being driven by the concrete conditions of England at the time and the existence of the Corn Laws. In Marx becomes the engine of history. So the class struggle is no longer just this English case and the landlords and the Corn Laws. It becomes really something that can go back and explain the Roman, struggle between plebeians and aristocracy. It can go obviously back to Byzantium, to the Arab world. And actually what makes Marx attractive to us now is that we can apply that to practically any historical period. And I think this is a big difference is actually, and then of course, Marx is also different in the sense that he brings what we talked about before, the German background and Hegelian background, which of course Ricardo did not have. And that of course leads to the conception of the different modes of production sort of replacing one another. And it also brings that aspect, which was Hegelian aspect, but of course transformed in case of Marx, of a millennial, first teleological view of history, and a millennial sort of denouement of history, which would come with communism. So these are, I think, significant elements, which of course are not at all in Ricardo. So you can actually see Ricardo to be a segment of Marx, but very important segment. And it's on Ricardo that Marx, after all, built his model of his view of the world. I think it's just to say, Lenin actually, I think, which is very much true, that in Marx, you have a combination of the English political economy, German philosophy, and French social thought, So I think it is true. And once again, underlies the pan-European aspect of Marx.
Yeah, it is interesting because you have a lot of Marxists in the academy who I think, Professor Milanovic, have sort of wavered from the political Marx or the Marx of historical materialism. I'm thinking of Kohei Saito, the degrowth communist thinker, who wants to argue that historical materialism is sort of a Eurocentric doctrine, and that we should sort of move beyond the political Marx in some way. And on my program here that we're discussing here, the Emancipations podcast, I think it's fair to say that I try to maintain a sort of fidelity to the political Marx. And perhaps maybe you agree that the political Marx is not in vogue today. But I actually wanted to ask you your thoughts on that, because one of the things you say, and I think you've even mentioned this on Twitter, that Marx was the most difficult subject of all the various economists that you study in your book, Visions of Inequality. And I want to know if that's true, if Marx is the most difficult, or maybe difficult's the wrong word, but maybe the most complex or the most dynamic.
More complex, yeah.
Because why? Well, precisely because, as you say, Marx says, quote, to clamor for equal or even equitable remuneration on the basis of the wage system is the same as to clamor for freedom on the basis of the slavery system. So therefore, Marx is a bit paradoxical for your work, because Marx has an indifference to inequality in some way. So that is counterintuitive. Yeah. Introduce us now to this idea of the not indifference, but the reality of inequality as Marx theorizes capitalism as a mode of production, right? Which you elaborate, largely working off of capital. Why is inequality not of interest to Marx? Why is it not of interest?
That quote that you just read is a phenomenal quote, actually. It is so well written, and it's brilliant. So one has to say, when to go back to the first part of your question, Marx is indeed the most complex author that I discuss in my book, and probably whatever would be the choice of writers or economists, I think Marx would stand out as being, as you said rightly, complex. He's also difficult, but complex, and I think complexity comes from the extremely wide spread of Marx's writings and interests. So it's very difficult to put them all together, simply because he has many sides. We've already mentioned this cosmopolitan side. You mentioned historical materialism. Then Ricardo, which is also a different side. Then a philosophical part, which goes back to Hegel. So, it really requires quite a lot of knowledge and ability to put it all together. Now, one can do that by essentially saying, as I said in the very beginning, okay, there are certain parts of Marx I will not discuss, but there are other parts that I will discuss. Now, when it comes to inequality, and the book, as you know, is about perceptions, visions of inequality of different authors, Marx poses the following problem, but only at first, because it's actually resolvable problem. At first, it poses a problem because nowadays we have become so much used to capitalism in some sense that we look at people on the left as being people simply who want to reduce inequality, have greater role of the state, have higher wage and all that. So when people look, they say, okay, well, they are leftists and they are extreme leftists, and Marx must be an extreme leftist consequently, he must have really cared so much more about inequality than, say, social democrats or Bernie Sanders. And that actually is wrong, because in the case of Marx, the objective is that you move to a totally different plane. So it's basically you're following one basic line, but at one point, which is Marx's point, you move somewhere else. And that somewhere else, that's the objective of a new socialist society that would abolish private property of capital. So the struggle under the capitalist society to reduce inequality, Marx is not against that. And actually, I think I use quite a lot of Shlomo Avineri in that respect. Avineri says, the struggle, or trade union struggle, I mean, obviously, Marx spent lots of time in Capital discussing numbers of hours of work of children, of women, exploitation, all of that. It's all good. We should actually do that, and political parties should do that. But this is not the ultimate objective. And moreover, Avineri says Marx sees that as the political struggle or trade union struggle as a way to create a society and to create links between people, which would be useful in a new society after we have abolished private ownership of capital, because that's the objective. So that's why, for Marx, the reduction of inequality under capitalism is desirable, or maybe, there is nothing wrong with political parties fighting for that. But one should not forget, this is not the final objective. The final objective, and Engels says this very clearly, also in the critique of the Gotha programs, he says it's the abolition of private property. And after that, we would actually discuss, and now there is this famous statement by Marx from, that under socialism, you will be still paid according to your contribution, but of course under communism you will be paid essentially according to your needs. So that's another discussion of inequality in the new society. And I think one has to really sort of put it in that context of three different societies: capitalism, socialism, and communism, to understand Marx's own thinking about inequality.
Yeah, this is helpful because there's a little anecdote that I always like to remind my Marxist comrades from Ferdinand Lassalle, who wanted to join an organization that Marx and Engels were part of called the Communist League. You may or may not be familiar with this, but I think it underscores what you're saying. Lassalle was opposed to increases in welfare for the working class because Lassalle had this idea of a kind of what you might call a kind of emiseration thesis through the iron law of wages that he developed, in which you discuss. Right. And everyone denied his entry into the Communist League because he didn't want increases in welfare for the working class. So Lassalle famously is kind of like this radical social democrat who is revolutionary, but is constantly missing the mark and has a poor theoretical understanding of capitalism. And he never understands Marx's theory. He never understands it properly. But Marx was the only one who still wanted to include Lassalle because I think he saw Lassalle as an ally to the wider cause, because Lassalle was very, very much more famous than Marx at the time amongst the working class. And one of the things that you say in your section on Marx that I wanted to ask you about is this idea of the working class in Marx's time as, and you pull from data that Marx did not have available regarding changes in the wage and the increase in the wage from the time of the founding of historical materialism in about 1845 through 1848, up through 1870s and on through beyond. And you show that there was actually a steady increase in some sense. But Marx didn't have that data really available. So I wanted to ask you, could you talk about that fact, that during Marx's time, the working class experiences something like an improvement in quality of life? Is that fair to say? And how does that, because you also say that as it pertains to the quality of life of the proletariat, the lumpen proletariat, and the wage laborer, Marx does not submit only to this idea of what's called the emiseration thesis.
Right.
It has multiple scenarios. You identify 4 scenarios of how income distribution could function. Speak about this data, though, about a kind of general improvement in income inequality during Marxist time. I think you say, for example, by the 1860s, the top 1% owned 60% of the total wealth of the society, whereas today it's like they own 30%. So there's a sort of general improvement in the capitalist system. Is that accurate? And can you explain this part?
Yeah, this is certainly accurate for the United Kingdom. And of course, as you know, Marx was really, most of the examples in Capital are really based on, UK or English data. Now, let me just say briefly, what was one of my objectives in that chapter, and maybe the most important objective? I really wanted to show, which some people also have argued, for example, Rosdolsky and Ernest Mandel and others, that Marx did not hold this view that is often associated of immiseration of labor. There are only 2 or 3 instances in all of his writings which can be interpreted like that, and they are written in political texts, and moreover, they are written at the time when he didn't study political economy. For example, the most famous statement is in the Communist Manifesto before he actually started really studying political economy. And my point was that Marx, within the system of his own system, totally accepted or could accept the increase in real wage of the working class. And there are many arguments there. I will not go into all of them, including the fact that, of course, Marx distinguishes between complex and simple labor, which by itself means that there is a differentiation of wages within the working class. So if there is a simple labor is a subsistence, well, complex labor cannot be a subsistence because complex labor is paid more. And then for Marx, all categories, including wants, desires, are historical. And it would be totally crazy to claim that there is such an important category as a wage that is not historical. Finally, Marx says very clearly that the wage depends on 2 parts, one a physiological part and another historical part, which depends on the level of development. So all these arguments are very clear to me. And actually, I think it was very clear if you read Marx as a writer over the years, that he would accept the increase of real wage under capitalism. And indeed, this is what happened in England. We have seen actually an increase which was kind of slow at first, but then somewhat accelerated, with, of course, ups and downs because of the Depression and so forth. But around 1867, actually, it was interesting that it just simply coincides with the date of the publication of Capital. We have clearly a much higher wage. I forget now, was it 25% higher than, for example, in 1820? So there was an increase over that period of about 40 years, which was not negligible. And indeed, Marx was aware of that. And if you look at the correspondence between Engels and Marx, they noticed that. And of course, Engels was actually paying the workers himself, so he had to know what was the wage. And then, of course, there is this attempt to explain that, of course, by capitalist development, but also by colonialism. And so that's actually where Engels introduces this idea that basically the British bourgeoisie lets workers have crumbs from the table from the exploitation of colonies and so forth. But in other words, actually, just to conclude, my objective in that chapter was to argue, and then I think on very strong textual and much more, even more analytical grounds, that Marx did not hold the view of, obviously, iron law wages, which he actually rejected a couple of times, and with emiseration as well. So he could have accepted that advanced capitalism is associated with rising real wage.
But still, nonetheless, Marx submits to what you call a kind of telos of the overcoming or dissolution of the capitalist world system through the working class and through the theory of the proletariat. And I wanted to ask you if you could maybe reflect on that thesis of classical Marxism. Obviously, a lot of people after the Second World War, with the rise of theories of monopoly capitalism, with the rise of neoliberalism or finance capitalism, have shown that the decline in the workers' movement has de-centered the proletariat as the historical agent of history. And I want to maybe ask you to reflect on that. What still remains of a sound quality of a is there still a correctness in the proletarian theory that Marxism is built upon? I can tell you my views, but I'd be very curious to see your opinion on that in general.
Of course, that's not in the book, but I would agree that actually the centrality of the proletariat does not have the same sort of importance empirically that it had in time of Marx. But before we continue, and actually would like to hear your opinion on that, but let me just sort of say that it would be kind of maybe vulgar Marxism to say that that essentially everything depends on real wage. So in other words, if there is a higher real wage and people feel better, then the whole sort of story of Marxism would just disappear. It is not true. Actually, the view that Marx had about the emancipation of the working class is really based on the existence of exploitation, which is defined as the fact that owners of means of production have a de facto monopoly over these means of production, let's suppose machines, and of course, whatever is the financial value of the machines. And they use that monopoly to hire people who don't have anything else but the labor power and consequently make an income. So it's actually unjustified, lack of justification of the existence of profit or interest, which is crucial. It's not whether the real wage is high and low. So I think the Marx would actually argue we have the issue of course, overcoming capitalism regardless of the high or low wage. Now, going back to your question, I do agree that there was a change, of course, in the sort of definition or in the perception of the working class and the working class today, for example, in the US, where, as you know, the level of trade unionization in the private sector is in single digits, is not the same thing as in England or Germany a century ago, so or maybe a century and a half ago. So yes, I would, but I'm actually curious what your view on that? Yeah,
I suppose maybe the best way to approach the question of the agency of historical change as the proletariat would be through the political writings of Marx as what you might call not a fetish for the working class or some kind of romantic identification with the working class, but I've always interpreted it as a strategic valve for the centrifugal point in capitalist society where this surplus is generated. So therefore, if you want to think of a political reorganization or transformation or even revolution of capitalism, that political insight of Marx into the working class still remains of paramount importance, right? As a truth of a capitalist system as such, right? Now, I think with that said, that then produces a number of problems of a moralistic and ethical nature, whereby the right wing, right, because we have a phenomenon, as you probably are aware, of the right wing abuse of the status of the working class. Take, for example, Trump and even J.D. Vance, right? Why is it that they speak about the working class more even than the left? Yeah. I mean, it's not that they're reading Marx, but in a way, we know there's a long history of the abuse of Marx by the right. I'm thinking here, for example, of the neocons who cut their teeth as Trotskyists.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So it's complex, but one does need to have, let's put it this way, not necessarily, well, one must maintain a kind of class viewpoint on capitalism, I think is the idea of historical materialism. That is not to necessarily privilege one class over the other, because I think that Marx understood that class struggle takes this multiple form. Marx is interested in slave rebellions, he's interested in national liberation struggles, and he's interested in struggles at the site of production. A lot of Marxists will say, well, the only thing that matters is the productive sphere. But I think that's actually a misreading of Marx, because Marx has this huge reservoir of work on other forms of class struggle. Yeah. However, just to conclude, I do think that the proletarian thesis still remains like a guiding strategy that should be used by the left, is how I would put it. I don't know
Yes,
if you agree.
I was, of course, in the discussion in Visions of Inequality, I was really looking at Marx at that time, and with some sort of connection, obviously, to the Marxist influence today. But uh, let me just reiterate this point that I believe that it is wrong, and as I would call it, vulgar Marxism, to link the existence of class struggle to the real wage. Part of the class struggle is to increase the real wage, but this is not the ultimate objective, nor can one actually argue that the class struggle really ends because the real wage is high. That actually is nonsensical, because you always continue struggling for the size of the pie. The pie is sort of given, and you try to get more of it. Secondly, you mentioned the fundamental distinction of classes within capitalist society. And as you know, in Visions of Inequality, I start with Francois Quesnay, and Physiocrats, continue with Adam Smith, which I think is a very interesting chapter and has also many sort of implications for Marx. As you know, Marx was a big Smith reader. Then Ricardo, then Marx, then I continue with Pareto, Simon Kuznets, and then neoclassicals. Now, what is interesting there, when you look at that, and it actually became apparent to me more as I was writing than so much before, you have everybody up to Pareto really discussing the class structure. It's always classes in income distribution, social classes. Then Pareto comes with elite versus the rest. Simon Kuznets says, well, we have a different view. It's now about whether you're in the urban and rural population, whether you're in manufacturing, agriculture. And then neoclassicals come, and all distinction is obliterated. There are only agents. Capital is simply one subscript, which is K. Labor is another subscript, which is L. It really all disappears. And that was striking, is that actually there is no class structure. There is no any a priori difference between people. Obviously, there is no gender. There is no race. There is nothing. And that was, I think, striking how other authors before neoclassical or neoliberal paradigm took over always had inequality as sort of components or struggle of different a priori defined groups. But there it disappears. And I think that was actually why I called that chapter The Eclipse, because once you assume that there are no distinctions, there is no income distribution study anymore. Well, everything is kind of justifiably earned by you or me. Doesn't matter whether you had capital and you have 10 times more than I. It's over. And that, I think, was really the great weakness of neoclassical economics.
Yeah. And so on the question of wages and how Marx theorizes wages, you make the helpful point that Marx theorizes wages not merely from the standpoint of production, but also from the standpoint of distribution. He unifies both in his conception of how income distribution will function and how the wage system will function. And that it's, as we've mentioned, it's not reducible to the emiseration thesis, and it's not reducible to what Lassalle called the iron law of wages. So therefore, could you fill in a little bit more? And here, the complexity of Marx is on display, and the mastery of Marx's understanding of the capitalist system is also on display, because Marx, in a way, becomes a hyper contemporary of our present, and all of the conversations we're having, from Piketty to your work and so on. Everyone wants to know the problem of inequality, and you really do a great job of showing that Karl Marx remains an essential thinker of inequality. He's not. I get the impression in your chapter on Marx that by no means is Marx sort of caught in the 19th century at all. Like, Marx helps us think capitalist crisis. He helps us think the the four directions by which income distribution and inequality could go, which I want to ask you about. But could we talk and elaborate a bit more on Marx's theory of wages in capitalism, if you don't mind, to sort of elaborate a little more there?
No, I would just like to kind of re-mention rather that one of the objectives of the chapter, as I was saying before, was to really disprove very clearly the view that Marx had, the opinion that wages would remain at the subsistence level and there would be miseration of the labor force and so on. He was quite, I was saying before, his system can accept the increase in real wage under capitalist conditions. However, as with capital, with which I'll come in a moment, there is always offsetting force in Marx. So it's not simple. The offsetting force is, there are two at least. One is the existence of the reserve army of labor. The reserve army of labor in Marx is a little bit like in neoclassical economics, people who do not really join the labor force under normal conditions. But when there is a pressure on wages, which means the wages tend to go up, when wages actually tend to go up, capitalists have an incentive to bring new people to work in order to control the increase in real wage. So that reserve army is there permanently as an army that is used to offset a possible increase in wages. Secondly, technological progress, according to Marx, is de-skilling. In other words, the technological progress comes in and essentially reduces the amount of skills that you need to do the work. For me, the very nice example that I remember when I was young, and actually I was impressed when I came to the US to actually see the level of skills in cashiers in supermarkets. In countries which didn't have electronic things, the cashiers really knew very well how to do arithmetic because they had to give you back. You give them, 100 units and the cost is, 17.35. They would know immediately how to calculate. In the system which is more technologically advanced, they have no idea. They just look at the numbers that are shown on the screen and they pay you back then. So that was the type of technological progress that Marxists had in mind. And the de-skilling then also is a pressure on wage. So there, it is not, as I was saying before, it's not a simple story with wages in Marx. It is really very complex. And likewise, when it comes, and I will not go into that except for one sentence, the second part of the distribution has to do with returns to capital. And there, of course, we have the famous tendency of the profit to go down. So the second sort of part of the distribution. And if you put these two strong forces together, let's suppose you accept the increase in real wage and you accept the tendency of the profit rate to fall, then you actually have an improvement in income distribution within the Marxist model. But both of them have, both the wage and the profit, have the opposite forces. I already talked about the wage. I will maybe say something about the profit in a minute, but there are forces of concentration of capital that actually play the opposite role. So that's why Marx is very complex, and I think it is wrong, definitely, to just have to claim that he had one theory of income distribution. As you said, actually, I have 4 different possibilities that are all based on Marx, and he didn't come in and say, okay, I really believe in that possibility. I think we can defend all 4 of them more or less. I'm not saying totally equally, but we can actually defend that each of them can be substantiated by Marx's own work.
Yeah, the 4 scenarios are very good. The optimistic, the regressive, the breakdown, and the polarized. And the polarized scenario of the evolution of income distribution, according to Marx, you link to the United States, where there does have we do witness a gradual increase in real wage,
right,
simultaneous to an increasing concentration in capital. And that actually interests me in a certain way, because then the class theory of Marx becomes not just focused on the working class, but it becomes a theory of the total deprivation of the fulfillment of the bourgeois revolution, insofar as the bourgeois revolution is about freedom. And so there's this contradiction that takes place in modern society, in which all classes are uniquely alienated. So Marx's theory of alienation has to be supplemented, I would say, even in this polarized, unequal society, yeah, such that even for the winners, you know, this whole liberal idea of a society of winners and losers and globalization, yeah, Marx kind of thinks that, but Marx allows you to think that even the petty bourgeois, the contradictory classes, or the lumpen proletariat, are experiencing a unique form of unfulfillment, dissatisfaction. This is why Marx is like Freud, you know, one of the great thinkers of the discontents of society. So I love the way you put that, because you don't say that, well, Marx only thinks breakdown. He only thinks crisis. He only, yeah. So maybe you could say something more about this, because breakdowns do happen. Yeah.
Sure.
But that doesn't describe our society in the West, in the core region.
No, absolutely not. And that's why I think actually Marx is a very rich thinker. As I mentioned, there are these four different, actually you mentioned too, the four different scenarios. Let me just say a few words about the one that actually I put like could be applied to the US and to advanced capitalist countries. There are three things in Marx which I think he believes can hold simultaneously. And actually we see them holding now simultaneously. Number one, increase in real wage. Number two, rising share of net output, which is received by capital. These two things are not in contradiction. Simply, you have increasing real wage can go together, as we see now in the United States, with the rising share of capital. And the third one, becomes difficult, but it is all consistent. Even within a classical framework, it's consistent. You can have the decline in the rate of profit. So you can have what happens is that you have a decline per unit in rate of profit per unit of dollar, but you have many more units of capital. These many more units of capital more than compensate for the decline in the rate of return per unit $1. And the share of capital in total output expands. At the same time, technological progress allows increase in real wage. And this is, I think, as I said, it's actually something that Marx argues very strongly. And actually, when he actually talks, even when he has these lectures, which are very good lectures about given to the workers in England, he says, you know, he starts with the assumption of increased real wage and says, but the share of labor in total output might go down, and the relative power of labor is diminished despite the fact that real wage goes up. And I think this is important to realize the distinction between real wage and the share of labor in total output. And moreover, then we have, that's why I was actually saying it's similar to the United States, we have greater concentration of capital, which is also consistent with all the things that I mentioned before, which can be translated nowadays in the greater concentration of top 1%, you know, or 5% in the US. So, you know, in that sense, one of the four models that Marx has in mind is very much what we observe in modern capitalism. And the other one, as you mentioned, was a sort of optimistic view, which might have been true during the period of the so-called the 30 glorious years, where the share of capital income in total output went down. And then since 1980s or 85, approximately, the share of capital in total output went up. And I think nobody disputes that. That, of course, was pointed out by Piketty. Even more recent work, which actually goes against Piketty, they still accept that there is a decline in the share of labor or increase in share of capital, but of course they claim that it was actually lower than what Piketty claimed. So there is no doubt that we now witness increased real wage and a decline in share of labor. And these two things are things that Marx very much emphasized.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting that Occupy Wall Street had this idea of 1% versus 99%. And I think, you know, we have left-wing sort of figures like Corbyn and Sanders that sort of picked up on that same idea of framing an egalitarian project through what I would consider to be sort of like a populist understanding of class. And then we also have on the right wing this idea that is very opposed to Marxism, which you mention in an interesting way, which is that why did Marx not consider state bureaucrats to be a class? Which is interesting because, you know, on the right, I understand, as I understand it, as I see it, they really do think it that way, right? They really do think that state bureaucrats are a unique class. And we have, even on the left, from Barbara Ehrenreich, the theory of the professional managerial class. And I always felt that that's opposed to Marx's theory of class. And it is. And I wanted to invite you to say something maybe about that perhaps Marx's theory of class is superior precisely because he's not reducing class to this, what ultimately I think becomes a populist understanding of class, becomes a cultural theory of class. Like it would almost be a theory of class too focused on the superstructure, not the base, when you just think about bureaucrats as the enemy, right? Have you thought much about that?
I have. Actually, it is something that is in my forthcoming book. It's actually the draft is ready, but it's a difficult issue. You know, there I think we should really go back to James Burnham. I think that the definition of the managerial revolution goes back to him. His book, as you know, is very Marxist, but he derives from that one class that Marx had, which is capitalist class. He derives essentially two classes. One is simply owners of capital who have no managerial function, simply shareholders, let's put it like that. And the second class are people who are not owners of the means of production, but manage these means of production. It's interesting that that particular distinction is already made in Marx, and there was this dual feature of a capitalist. In a traditional capitalist system, capitalist fulfills two functions, and you practically see one man, one person fulfilling these two functions. One is I have my own capital. Secondly, by having this capital, I hire you, and I decide what you're going to produce and what you're going to do, and that's very simple. But as capitalism develops, and that's what Marx notices with the appearance of the joint stock companies, the two functions become sort of dissociated. Burnham actually starts from that position in a very Marxist way and claims there are two classes, no longer one class. And then, of course, the managerial revolution, as you know, is the story of the managerial class becoming the sort of the ruling class and taking over, and capitalists really fulfill no other function except that they go to Florida, you know, golf and receive from time to time the dividends. And then, of course, as you know, that continues later with John Kenneth Galbraith, with Raymond Aron and all of that. And I think it's very interesting that it actually goes back to this double function of capitalists that Marx has noticed. Nowadays, of course, it has sort of gone with professional managerial class and the role of the state. But I would say that I'm not really, so to take this with big grain of salt, because it really deals with current situation in the US. I think when they talk about the state and professional managerial class, I mean, I think they are really, it seems to me, talking about the fact that the state, or the deep state, has been taken over by the ideology of a professional class which is spread through the educational system. So I'm not sure that they really have a class structure in the way that we are talking about. I think it's much more, as you said, cultural. And it was never clear to me, I actually read a couple of these articles, it was never clear to me where that class ideology comes from, because in Marxist view is always based on production. And then suddenly we have this ideology that, according to the right wing, is being spread by universities, whose origin is very unclear to me. So, but anyway, take this with a grain of salt, because I'm not really that familiar with the most current view of J.D. Vance and the others.
Well, I think it's an opportunistic way of thinking about class. I mean, I think to go back to this point that I tried to raise about the strength of Marx's class theory as a strategy for overcoming capital and the dominance of capital. Like if you take, for example, Lukács, the great Marxist philosopher,
Right. Yeah.
he wrote a review of Burnham's Managerial Revolution, in which he referred to Burnham as the kind of American Mussolini, because he's sort of advocating almost like a corporatist takeover. And then from that, you almost have a kind of theory of a nascent fascism, where the terrain of struggle becomes this cultural bourgeoisie thought of purely as a bureaucracy. And I just feel that strategically, that diverts us away from contesting the capital wage relation. And it also moves attention away from the category of what Marx called labor power, which we haven't mentioned. But I felt that that category of labor power is something that is of utmost significance and importance for thinking the centrality of, like, you know, the proletariat or of even the working class, precisely because it goes into the core of Marx's theory about where the generation of surplus value actually emerges from, right? And so I just feel that this culturalization of class becomes opposed to the Marxist understanding of capital in general. And I'm just not sure how strategic it is. And it also, frankly, throws us into this tailspin of the culture wars, you know, and the culturalization of politics, which I think moves us away from political economy, you know. So I mean, I have many problems with it. Of course it's real, you know, of course the problem of the professional managerial class is real. We shouldn't ignore that, and it has certain effects. But are the effects of the dominance of the PMC, how are they affecting exploitation? Right, that's my question, in a real way. Yeah. And so perhaps you could say something regarding Marx's theory of labor power, because I always feel that this is the heart of Marx's wider conception that the worker in capitalism is subordinated to the status of a commodity, and that the idea of class consciousness entails this type of realization of the commodification of their labor power, right?
Yeah.
And this is a message that should be the center point of the left, in my opinion, that awareness, right? This kind of ABCs of Marxism. It's why I think reading Capital should be mandatory for workers, you know. And so maybe I could ask you that question, but also for you to sort of say, like, yeah, like, do you agree that that Marx has something to teach not only to academics, but perhaps to workers in today's time as a political framework of thinking capitalist social reality? Because when we go down this culturalization of class, I think we obscure the site of where exploitation is taking place. That's
Okay, on that last point, I totally agree, actually, and that's what when I was criticizing minutes ago when I spoke of the perception of the sort of populist right and class wars in their perception is something which really is cultural and the basis of which are totally unclear to me. But let me go back to Burnham, because I think Burnham is an important thinker. Yes, of course, I know Lukács's sort of critique. And it is true when you look in the context of what actually happened. But I think that Burnham's work, the managerial revolution, is very, I mean, if you look even the way that it was written, is very strongly Marxist. It's simply that he is using, as I was saying before, he's using this double function to create a new class from that double function. And that class then, of course, becomes, in his view, the ruling class. And actually, the new system is not socialism, but is managerialism. And he actually had a good point in 1941 that there were strong similarities between, of course, Mussolini, between the Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the New Deal United States. So that was, he was later proven wrong. But if you read him in 1941, it's actually a pretty sort of the arguments are quite well made. But he was more recently used in the case of PMC in a bizarre way, because Burnham is still talking about the class being created at a place of work. And now we are talking about class being created in some kind of cultural vacuum. And that, I think, is the difference between him and the misuse or repurposing of him. Now, going back to the question that you asked me, yes, the key part in Marx is the understanding of what is worker selling. And he's actually only renting, not even selling, he is renting his labor power. So that means that we all have in ourselves a possibility to, of course, rent out our labor for, and actually that's what Marx called labor power, for a given number of hours. Specificity of that particular commodity, and we are paid according to the value of that commodity. That's what Marx always says. There is no cheating there. We are paid according to the value of that commodity. But the specificity of this commodity, which is called labor power, is that within 8 hours that we are renting it out, we produce greater value, or meaning basically more things, than we need to bring ourselves to the original state in which we were before selling that labor power. In other words, if I work 8 hours and you pay me only in goods which are produced in 4 hours, I would be actually equally well off as in the beginning of the process, because I need to eat, I need to drink, I need clothes, I need to sleep, whatever, I need a bed and so on, and you would give me this. And I have produced 8 hours worth of goods for you, and you have paid me back with 4 hours of goods which are produced, but that brings me back to the same state in which I was originally. So there is no cheating. This was the value of labor power that I sold to you, and you paid me back. So that was the origin of exploitation, is simply the discrepancy between the ability of labor through labor power to produce greater value than they receive back. And this is, of course, the key. And this is something that you cannot, how should I say, there is no real wage that could negate that, except the real wage, which would be actually equal to that production. And which Marx, of course, says there will be never the same, because you would always have to have depreciation, to pay depreciation, to pay, other general needs, the state and all of that. But it doesn't mean that you would have to pay the private owner of capital. So that's where the fundamental thing is located in Marx, is without exploitation, there is no positive rate of profit. If there is no positive rate of profit, if the profit rate is zero, as Ricardo said, as Schumpeter says, capitalism ends. It ends in the same way that if you were to pay workers zero, you would not have anybody to work. Likewise, you're not going to have capitalists invest their income if the rate of return, their capital, if the rate of return is zero. And that's why, of course, when Ricardo talks about his own capitalist model, the fear that he has is stationary economy where the rate of return is zero. So it's basically simply replacing the production that you have already made. In other words, there is no growth. So there is no capitalism with zero rate of return. That's an impossibility. And that means that there is no capitalism without exploitation, and that's the end of the story.
Right. Even, which means that Marx accounts for this fluctuation in stabilization of wages, but the exploitation still remains constant,
right?
Which poses a threat to the freedom of all individuals and classes within the system. Okay. One question that you do touch upon, and I think you are largely dismissive of this theory, many are, which is what's called the labor aristocracy theory, which I think in Marxism is very much tied into the idea of imperialism,
right? Yeah.
Which Lenin, of course, theorizes as a stage, the highest stage of capitalism. And Lenin, as you know, is interesting because Lenin saw imperialism as tied into monopoly capitalism, but he saw that as an opportunity for global revolution, right? He called it the antechamber of socialism. And a lot of Marxists, like the wonderful Japanese Marxist Kojin Karatani, argues that neoliberalism is a stage of imperialism. Yeah. And I was wondering if you thought that this old idea of Marx, of labor aristocracy theory, if you might reflect on it, to understand perhaps, and this is one question from the chat, like even the question of the professional managerial class itself, like do you put any currency or stock or fidelity to this idea that, one, we can theorize our contemporary world system through the Marxist theory of imperialism, and then related to that, might this labor aristocracy theory give us something to work with, maybe purely within the field of ideology?
Okay, first let me say a few things about things that I am defending, I think, more strongly, and then about things that I'm not quite sure. The things that I think are defensible strongly are that the idea of the labor aristocracy comes, as we mentioned it before, when Marx and Engels noticed the increase in real wage, and they try to explain that, and they actually see that exploitation of colonies can provide one of the ways in which it could be explained. So essentially, the dominant bourgeoisie, worldwide dominant bourgeoisie, is able to pay a little bit more to the workers to make them happy and not to make too much trouble. And they are actually sort of, the explanation comes from there. I think Lenin very rightly reuses that theory, because in Lenin's view, he's of course comes much later after Marx, his view is global. Marx, as we were talking before, actually gradually moves towards a global world, but he dies in 1883, so it was still relatively early, whereas, of course, after World War I, the situation is totally globalized. Now, whether that particular theory can hold today, I'm not so sure about this, because we don't have colonialism in the classical way anymore. And we do have a differently organized world with sort of divided units of the states, countries. We have the role of large countries like China, India, and so forth. So I'm not sure that American capitalists are actually now using globalization to increase wages of workers. Actually, we can even argue that's the opposite. It seems the American capitalists are actually selling, outsourcing and offshoring in order, of course, to hire cheaper labor and to drive the wage of American workers down. So I'm not sure that actually this whole idea from the 1860s that Marx and Engels had, that would assuage class struggle through the sharing of the spoils of colonization, really applies in the time of globalization now.
That is
because it seems to me it's the very opposite, because if it were the case, we would not actually have had, of course, the famous elephant chart. We would not have had a stagnation of very small increase in real wage in the US compared to the wages of the top people and compared to capital incomes. So we would not have the problem which actually brought Trump to power in some sense. I think that Trump came to power precisely because American capitalists were unwilling to share their income with the middle class and the working class.
So then, if the system is no longer tied to a theory of imperialism vis-a-vis colonial domination or relations of domination, how might you theorize, at least from the standpoint of the economics of the system, the new sort of multipolarity, what people use, multipolarity? I don't know if you agree with this concept as a plausible explanation for the various wars that are occurring from Ukraine to Gaza, because I think that the traditional Marxist theory of imperialism provides a kind of very compelling account of the causes of global conflict. How might you theorize the new imperialisms and multipolarity then?
It's a difficult question. It's a little bit beyond the scope, I think, of the conversation so far. I think that we are at the juncture where the unipolar world, I cannot say is necessarily going down. It's because it's really a big question what will be the outcomes of all these different wars. One outcome could be, and that seems kind of reasonable to assume now, that it could be a multipolar world simply because of the importance of China and because these wars, actually, particularly Russia-Ukraine war, from the Russian point of view, is really being fought for the creation of Russia as a pole. I think that was the purpose of the war. I think Ukraine is simply a tool to actually make Russia a pole. And it might be successful. It might also not be successful, but I'm not, I think that we are at a juncture where we don't know which way in the next 20 years, hopefully we would survive, because it could be another possibility that basically civilization is obliterated, in which case the whole question of whether there is one pole or five poles is totally irrelevant. But assuming it doesn't happen, I think that we are now at the juncture where we basically are deciding militarily whether there will be a multipolar world or a unipolar world. And I'm not exactly sure how that the imperialist sort of thesis fits there, because it could be, you could actually, and there actually I read a couple of Russian authors who actually claim that the Russian war on Ukraine is clearly also an imperialist war, which is driven by the class structure of Russia, by the oligarchs who actually want to have the control over the former territory of the Soviet Union, essentially. Economic control, not necessarily political control. So I think there are these different ways to looking at it. But I just want to go back to what they said. We simply wanted to emphasize that it does not seem to me that this worker aristocracy idea, it really is applicable to the conditions in the US. And as I was saying before, it seems to me it's the very opposite. It is actually absence of the, how should I say, empathy or interest by the rich Americans or by the rich American capitalists for their own working class. I think they were not, they didn't care about them, and they didn't want to share anything with them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for that. I know that was slightly off topic from the question of inequality in Marx. This has been a very rich conversation, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about applying Marx and Marx's insights for the problem of inequality in our time. We've talked about a little bit of it, but perhaps you could reflect a bit more, if you're so willing, about Marxism in the 21st century and what might be derived from the teachings of Marx, the analysis of Marx, the critique of political economy for solving the problems of global inequality. And I also was curious, if I might, ask you if you consider yourself a Marxist or some type of Marxist. I'd never asked you that question, but I wanted to see how you responded to that as well. So sort of a two-part question. How does Marx live today? And, you know, we see a lot of thinkers moving naturally towards Marxist solutions. And I'm wondering if you see a similar tendency amongst your peers, academic economists, right? How is Marx thought amongst your peers? Is he thought at all, or is he misunderstood? So maybe some more reflections on Marx as a prescriptive for solving proactively these problems of inequality.
Let me just pull the curtain. I'm being, there is too much sun going in my face. It is, I think, better now. Okay. First, let me say something first. What I think, I mentioned this in the book. What is a development that would have actually somewhat confused Marx and that he didn't expect? This is what I call, and it comes from Capitalism alone, what they call homoplotia. It's the fact that actually we now have in advanced capitalist economies, we have at the top, let's say take the top 10% in the US, actually empirically you look at that, and you find that there is 1/3 of these people at the top
who are also at the top in terms of their labor income and at the top in their capital income. And this is a really total new development, that you have the same people who are among rich capitalists and among rich workers, because they also have, I mean, many of them have actually work salary. They may be managers, but we know that from Marx's point of view, and even from the point of view of national accounts, this is the labor income. Whether the labor income is high, that's a separate issue. But if you have to show up there and to work and to sell your labor power, you are a laborer. So this is a development which is both hopeful and bad. They say hopeful in the sense that it breaks the dividing line, or the division between capitalists and workers, which historically existed and which actually informs all this work that we were talking about, is that basically you have people who are capitalist class, people who are working class, they don't overlap. Here, that distinction disappears because I'm at the same time rich capitalist and rich worker. On the other hand, the fact is that creates an elite, which is a very strong elite, because they have a high capital income, of course, high wealth, high level of education, and very high paying jobs. And consequently, it makes it very difficult for them to lose their power, because if something goes bad with capital income, they will have high labor income, and the reverse. Secondly, they're also able to transfer that wealth to the next generation. And third, they have a meritocratic element, which I think is important. For example, the book by Daniel Markowitz is phenomenal on that, which gives them a feeling that this is something which is totally deserved. Because if they work and they are very rich, they feel actually we deserve all of that. They forget maybe they got some inheritance to start with, and they treat others as being, who are not as wealthy as them, as not deserving to be wealthy, because either they're lazy or they're not smart. So I think this component there is such an elitist component that is very difficult to overcome. And that, I think, is something which is new, in the sense that these two types of income have not, labor and capital, have now been unified in the same persons. Now, going to prescriptive part that you asked me to reflect, I think that what is important actually to take from Marx, maybe two different types of points. One is really an analytical point. We talked about that today, that you could have increase in real wage and the decline in the labor share. At the same time, you could also have the decline in rate of return per unit of capital. This is all analytic. But there is also a substantive core, which is the issue of exploitation and each issue of justification of the income from capital. And I think this is a substantive core. And this is not the issue, and I would like to mention that it's not an issue of whether capital is productive or not productive. It's the issue of the rules of the game. Because to that argument, I would always say, take slavery. A worker who is a slave is also, I mean, if you take marginal productivity theory, he's also producing X. Well, he's not being paid X, he's paying 1/2 of X, because he's a slave and you just pay him the subsistence, because the social structure is such that you pay him whatever you want to pay for him to survive. Consequently, that's the issue, is not the productivity of the factor of production. The issue is what is the legal structure of the system. And I think that's how we explain rate of interest or profit, is the legal structure of the system allows that. And I think it's an important point, because neoclassicals always talk about productivity of the factors of production, forgetting that productivity is embedded in the legal rights. If you don't have the legal right, you will not get that interest or that profit. And I think that's important that's important insight that Marx has. Finally, then you asked me about whether I am Marxist or not. I would say, in a way that I take analytically things that we were talking about, certainly I am Marxist, and I think most of the people are Marxist, because basically economics is an application of essentially materialism, or historical materialism is really so deeply linked with economics. We explain all the phenomena by basically economic factors.
And that, of course, was not the Marx who invented it, but Marx really applied it on a big scale. Now, do I believe that the new system as defined by Marx with nationalization of the means of production is sort of on a horizon? I don't. I think we have tried that system. For many reasons, the system did not work. And I don't believe that that would be the next system. On the other hand, do I believe that capitalism is a historical mode of production? Yes, I do. And I think it's very important. And I think that we cannot now tell what will be the next mode of production. Maybe it will come in 500 years. Maybe we don't know it. But to believe that we have discovered the ultimate mode of production that would actually last from now until the end of human history, I believe it is really a fantasy. You know, every mode of production responds to the historical conditions. Capitalism responds to historical conditions, and historical conditions can change. So I believe it's a transitory, it's a historical mode of production, and it's not what is called natural mode of production that many people believe. So it's a complicated answer, you know, there are pluses and minuses, but I think that was the last point about historicity of capitalism, I believe, is an important point.
Thank you for that. It seems to me your first part about the intrinsic challenge of the meritocratic sort of ideology of the 10%, the wealthiest 10% in the West. In your book, Capitalism Alone, you call this meritocratic capitalism as a paradigm. And I found it fascinating that you link the philosophy of John Rawls to sort of the underbelly justification of that paradigm. Because I was just speaking to a colleague of mine who is a Marxist Rawlsian, and he wants to say that actually Rawls really thinks a kind of mutual ownership model, and he's a socialistic thinker. It's a very interesting side point. And I think the other point I wanted to say is, like, it's today we have in the ruling class ideology the reversal of Veblen's theory of conspicuous consumption. Right? Insofar as Veblen had the idea that the ruling class are kind of detethered from productive labor. So the struggle between proletariat bourgeoisie entails, it could entail this fight over the might of the working class as the true productive agents. Whereas today, the ideology of the ruling class almost forecloses that possibility in a certain way. And that I think is a very, that poses a lot of challenges to socialist politics, I believe, if that makes sense. And then secondly, your point about legal, like bourgeois legal ideology, that seems to me to be a point regarding Marx and the necessity of extra parliamentary activity. I mean, why did Marx say that the seizure of the state by the working class in the Paris Commune has to suspend bourgeois legal right? I feel like that's connected to that point. In other words, Marxism is not content with merely contesting power at the parliamentary Republican level. There has to be more than that, extra parliamentary measures, which I think is a true point of Marx. And I just wanted to reiterate for listeners the importance of your book, Capitalism Alone. And I wonder if anything regarding your treatment of China as authoritarian state capitalism, I think is how you defined it, has anything changed regarding your views on China since you wrote that text? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Actually, I would say, I mean, I know many people say that as a matter of course, but I really mean it. It has actually reinforced the work that I did since with different Chinese co-authors. It has reinforced this view. For example, I did the paper, and that's also now in my new book in part, about the change in a little bit of that is already in Capitalism Alone, about the change in the social structure at the top 5% in China. And what was actually very interesting there, of course, that's not surprising, but it's interesting to see it in numbers, how much it has changed over the last 30 years, so that now more than half of the people in the top 5% in China are people who are large capitalists, small capitalists, what they call individual ownership, which means employing less than 8 people,
and PMC, professional managerial class, working in private companies. So it's a really significant change. And I also try to explain in my forthcoming book that I believe that it does lead to a reaction that Xi Jinping represents. It's actually an attempt to sort of push back against essentially capitalization or privatization of the very top functions. What is also interesting, and that was not in capitalism alone, is that because the Chinese actually very interestingly published the data on the membership of the Communist Party with household survey data about income. What you find is that the very top capitalists who are also members of the Communist Party are particularly rich. In other words, what is the implication of that is that the Communist Party membership for those rich people is really very important credential that allows them to probably get jobs, orders, connections that they would not have been able to get without membership of the party. So the membership of the party is really sort of little bit like in the US going to Ivy League university. It's a credential. It's something that maybe you don't deserve it, but somehow you get it, and that actually is something that helps you have higher income. And in that sense, we see very clearly a class structure that, as I mentioned, this forthcoming book, I'm actually putting the US class structure with homo plutia and meritocracy, and in the sort of as a counterpose to the Chinese one, which is also now privately owned wealth, plus CPC membership. So I think that this sort of capitalist nature of China, in my opinion, has been reinforced, and one should not look simply at the fact that the higher role of the state in China does exist. There is no doubt about that, but that doesn't make it non-capitalist.
Finally, Professor Milanovic, first of all, I want to thank you for joining our program. There's been many questions. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of the questions in the chat, but I wanted to invite you to say something about your current research, what you are. I have the sense that you're working on theory of classes. Is that correct in your current work?
I'm actually trying to understand in the current book that I think hopefully should come out next fall, because the time lag between completion of the manuscript and the publication now is almost a year. The book has two objectives. It's actually to understand the current change in this multipolar versus unipolar world and what does China represent, which I think is absolutely crucial, because I think that particularly when you look at global inequality, that's where my idea came from. You have what now China and Asia, the rise of China and Asia are doing is exactly the same as the Industrial Revolution did in the beginning of the 19th century. It has two impacts, and that's the main story of the book. There is an impact at the power of nation states, so there is a change in power between, let's suppose, US versus China. But there is also an impact on individual incomes, yours and mine and everybody else's. The rise of Asia simply means that the first time in 200 years that we have the data, you have large participation of Asian middle class among the top income holders, and that participation would become larger and larger, which means that the hegemony on an individual level, hegemony of the West on the top income group has now being eroded. So we have, as I was saying, two effects. One is an effect at the level of countries and mutual and the power of one country versus another. Another effect is individual effect. And that was actually, you can say, that was the effect that was on the US working class. That was an effect on me or you or anybody else. But it's, of course, a positive effect on Asian incomes, individual incomes that are rising. So this is the current what I'm currently working on, and also that the class structure that I mentioned between US and China, where actually we have, interestingly, really very good data, including from China. And in some sense, even Chinese are more interesting data because they give you for the very top, they give you what they are sociologically, what they are. in the US, when you use, for example, tax data, you have the shares of income, but you don't really have information about who these people are at the top. So it's not easy to combine in some cases.
We'll have to have you back to discuss the forthcoming work, and it's been a pleasure to dialogue with you this morning. Apologies if we didn't get to your questions, but I thought this was very rich and very informative. So thank you for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful, holiday season. And thanks again.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure. We discussed quite a lot of topics, and I really am very grateful for you to have brought up all of them. And excellent questions and excellent discussion. Thank you. And
thank you, everyone. All the best.
Thank you.